feature that marked off what we think of as 60s music from other forms of music was that sense of possibility, that sense that the musicians felt and communicated that some immense change was about to happen. Now, of course, it turns out that at least from our perspective today, it looks like they were wrong, at least in the short run. But that feeling that new possibilities of every kind, including gender relationships, were opening up. And the Dead managed to somehow keep that feeling alive for people, so that even on a bad night, you could feel that you wanted to come back the next night to see what happened.
Did any of you take time off to do touring, to follow the band at all?
Well, I never did a tour. I saw, I think, 7 shows in a period of a couple months once, but I never really followed them around on tour.
I guess in that respect, none of us are serious Deadheads. We're not that sort of...
that next level.
Right, that died in the world. We're not the kind of people who commit our lives.
What do you think motivated that kind of thing? Which seems to me unique in human culture.
I think it has to do with just the allure of the road. You think of Kerouac's On the Road, and you think of the picaresque, the travel narrative throughout, I think, all of Anglo-American literary history, for sure, if not other cultures as well. There's something about, again, I think there's something about the potential in a journey. One never knows what's going to happen. The sense of perhaps enlightenment or some sort of ecstatic experience, this increase in the fund of knowledge, just by being on the road and seeing different aspects. Different aspects of the geography and the cultural aspects, even within a country this size. There's a whole wealth of experiences to be had. So I think the allure of traveling was a part of that motivation to travel with the Dead.
Yeah, I think that's true. I read an article, an interview with Jerry Garcia once, and he said that the Grateful Dead was the last great adventure. You know, for the youth of America. It used to be you could run off and join the circus, or hobo around on the trains or something, and join the merchant marine, I guess, and sail to China or something. But the Grateful Dead were giving America this last great adventure where kids could just go and they could travel around and they could live a different type of life and experience new experiences, which was definitely alternative to the mainstream American culture. And it was an adventure, and it was a learning experience. And then most people would do it for a while, and then they'd go back and they'd be changed, but they'd go back to their community and live their lives.
I think it's worth saying that if the Grateful Dead had to depend only on people who were following them on tour, they would not have been nearly as successful, because they depended mainly on people like us, people who are, who have professions, who are pursuing careers, who are, in a lot of ways, pretty mainstream and pretty sort of sober middle-class people, and we would sort of take off on that kind of vacation, if you like, 4, 5, 6 times a year, perhaps, on 4, 5, 6 days a year. I think we were sort of the real financial mainstay of the Grateful Dead, people like us.
But certainly the tour added a dimension to the experience for the crowd, being in a group, some of whom, have been doing this now for months or weeks.
There certainly was this sense that when, let's say, when the tour came to your town, to Denver in our case, there was this sense that an alternative community had arrived, and that it was a mobile community. It was on the bus. And so since for our individual reasons we weren't willing to take that trip across the country, when the bus arrived here, we would get on for 2 or 3 days or whatever, and then it would leave. And it was kind of like, it was like a traveling circus. And it was like the circus coming to town.
Yeah, I mean, you could just go down the Pearl Street Mall when the Dead were in town, and you could tell that the Dead were in town because the Deadheads were there.
And there was something very satisfying when that culture, when that community was working well. And in a sense, it's a lot like what we were saying before about the music. Sometimes, obviously, it didn't work well at all. I mean, there were some people who messed themselves up really badly, as we know, being Deadheads. And there were times when being in that on-tour community was a real bummer. And it was just destructive for people. But when it was working well, it had that sense of cooperation, that sense of possibility, that sense of sort of fulfilling utopian fantasies, of keeping the 60s fantasy alive. that I think thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people found very satisfying, even if you only did it for a few days each year.
A very intentional community with a sense of itself.
Very self-conscious.
And on
yes.
the move.
Yeah. And in that sense, like a cult.
How much do you think that those values were encouraged by the band? And how much of it was more a spontaneous outgrowth of the 60s and the band just happened to fit, so that's where people went with that energy?
I don't think the Dead ever encouraged a bunch of people to follow them around. They saw themselves as a band, and this is what they did, and this is what they loved. And they were just going to go out and do it. This is what we do, and we're going to go do it. And I think they were kind of surprised that people, were so fanatical about them, and that people did follow them around. But they never encouraged that type of behavior.
But it certainly fed their energy. We started off talking about the interaction between the band and the audience, in a certain sense, was the community. And so I don't think the Grateful Dead could have been, as musicians, what they were and gone on for so long as they did without that sense of fanaticism of their following.
And although they didn't encourage them, they did help them out. I mean, they would try to, in the 80s, they would try to set up little camping areas, make sure there were areas that they could camp. And sometimes they'd, like in the Oakland Coliseum for a while, they'll let people camp in the parking lot overnight. That went on for a number of years before Oakland said no more and they had to leave every night. But they did try to, even though they weren't telling people follow us around, they did try to help them out. When
they felt responsible to some degree. After what was it, Touch of Grey, their one really big hit song, and they became a national phenomenon. I mean, it's worth remembering that before 1986, the Grateful Dead played at Red Rocks, and they would sell 9,000 tickets a night or something, and it was much more in that sense a kind of a cult thing. And then in 86, 87, they became mega stars, and it was a tremendous burden for them because they were attracting all these people who didn't know how to keep the scene clean, as it were.
And I think after In the Dark came out in 1987, you got a lot of folks coming to see the scene more so than the music. And I think that, to me, was a turning point in the Grateful Dead in terms of this mega popularity and the ability to maintain that on-the-bus lifestyle when people started to lose touch with the fact that this is primarily a musical experience and not coming to the carnival in the parking lot. When you have thousands of people coming to the parking lot, not only without tickets, but without any intention to try to procure tickets, that started to get, I think, in the way.
And they were very well aware of how almost eager the mainstream media was for something to go wrong. And I mean, it's very tragic, of course, that it was during their last tour that all those things did go wrong, and it ended in such a sour note. But whenever anything, even something small, went wrong, the media just wanted to somehow stereotype the Grateful Dead as some kind of, I don't know, socially pathological phenomenon or something. And essentially what it was, I think, was 60s bashing, which is still a very favorite kind of enterprise of the mainstream media, because the mainstream media represent a kind of a fear of the 60s. And so you had all these strange images and stereotypes about the Grateful Dead, and they were very sensitive to not want anything to happen that might give any substance or any reality to those negative stereotypes.
One of the values that I thought we should spend a little time talking about is the transformation, and coming out of the 60s, and the idea that society can progress and it can become better than it was. Reminded of a bumper sticker, I'm sure you've seen them around this town, peace through music. That was my sense, that a lot of people had a serious feeling for that, and that was part of what was motivating them, their intention to be a part of that community.
I think in that sense, the Grateful Dead, the musicians, the Grateful Dead family, the people who kept that enterprise going, they were well aware of that. And again, that was part of their concern that things should not go wrong, that the scene should be kept clean, because they wanted to keep alive that image as much as possible, at least, that they did represent some very positive value, some very positive sense of possibility for the future coming out of the 60s. And so they wanted to encourage people to bring out the best in that culture and to try to minimize all the problems that inevitably went along with it.
Yeah, I think in terms of social transformation, even outside of the Grateful Dead, the individual members, I think, genuinely believed in some sort of social progression through music. And I think particularly about Phil Lesh and Mickey Hart and their involvement with music and education, and Mickey Hart's interest in bringing world music to a wider audience, and Phil Lesh's continuing interest in music education. And these, to me, are signs that the band was, and for those that are still living, still are, involved in making music a potential arena for transformation, for growth, for community awareness.
Well, here at the halfway point, I should probably take a little administrative break and mention that you are listening to Hemispheres on KGNU. I'm Richard Curtis, the host this evening, and we're speaking with Ira Chernus, Professor of Religious Studies, and Steve Glickman, PhD student in English, and Chris O'Reilly, resident KGNU Deadhead. We're also open to taking calls from the audience. Should you have any questions or comments on this subject, you can reach us at 449-4885. If you're calling long distance, that number's 1-800-737-3030. On a little bit of a more serious note, I heard someone talking on a Pacifica News report last week, a musician who was involved with Kwanzaa celebration somewhere, I think, on the East Coast. And he was talking about a teacher of his who had made the point that art is not a mirror to reflect society, that art is a hammer with which to mold society. And when I think back about the Grateful Dead and my experiences with that and experiences with the kind of energy that we've been talking about, I feel a little disappointed, because in spite of the intentions, it seemed like that didn't really happen. That maybe it could have after Touch of Grey, when the band achieved this great national renown. But that was the time at which things began to fall apart, that the band couldn't contain the energy of the crowd when the crowd got to a certain point, and people weren't coming to the show with the values already. They were coming to see the spectacle.
I think you might be expecting too much from them. I mean, they're just a bunch of guys who started a rock and roll band, and they were a band. I mean, and all of a sudden, like after in the Dark, they became very popular, but they weren't these perfect people who were doing something, wanting to change the world, or had these great concepts on how to mold society or anything like that. I think it would be overwhelming for anybody to be in their position. And keep in mind that they never saw the Grateful Dead. They were the Grateful Dead, but they were looking at it from a different perspective than everybody else in the world. And so I know if I was in that position, that would be a very difficult position to be in.
And I think they were involved in trying to encourage the audience to appreciate some of these, quote, Grateful Dead values. I think about things like Dupree's Diamond News, which is now a full-blown magazine, used to be just a newsletter. And even before that last disastrous concert tour, there were already problems with too many people, not enough tickets, getting in the way of the communities in which the Grateful Dead would be playing. And they would put the word out through this newsletter that was distributed in the parking lot, saying, look, we need to kick back, we need to stop coming to concerts without tickets. And like Chris was saying, there's only so much that they could have done short of not touring anymore as their political statement. So it always seemed to me that they tried to be as involved as possible without becoming the man, the establishment, some sort of domineering authority, telling the audience what they ought to be doing.
They certainly, in the interviews that I've heard and read, they certainly did have a sense of their cultural importance and a sense of representing certain values. And I think one of the things that happened is, of course, when they started, there were dozens, hundreds of successful bands that represented more or less the same kinds of values, that same hope for transformation. And as time went on, all those other bands, by and large, disappeared. And so in a certain way, the Grateful Dead were burdened by their audience, by the media, with that image because there were no other bands around to carry that image.
Right, it was by default, basically.
Right. And so if you think of it in those terms, of course, it reminds us of what an immense uphill battle any artists who came out of the 60s and were trying to hold on to those utopian visions, that sense of unlimited possibility that the art originally was trying to express. Anybody who was trying to hold on to that in the face of even of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and then with the Grateful Dead, they survived the Reagan-Bush era. I mean, it's extraordinary. They flourished, right? And so if you think of it in those terms, then rather than seeing the limitations, I would, I guess, see the success. I would see the glass as half full rather than half empty, that they managed to carry something on and to bring it to hundreds of thousands of people when virtually nobody else was doing it.
Oh, you know, it's interesting that you all took off in that direction, because I think I would put a little bit of a different spin on it, my sadness, as I put it. If society is going to change, it would seem foolish to expect that, you know, 5 guys and maybe 1 woman, depending on what year you're listening to the shows, could make that change. It's the energy that they're helping to create, but it's the audience that represents the populace in the country. It's the audience that has to take that energy and those values back home and to embody them there and to make change there. And I wonder if that whole notion of using music, using art, is not flawed. I guess I would disagree with the idea that art is a hammer. And I wonder if the Grateful Dead experience...
It really depends on the context, doesn't it? My understanding is that if you look at some revolutionary movements around the world, I guess maybe the ones in Latin America are the ones that are more familiar to us here, that music played and is still playing a tremendous role, right? But there you've got a kind of a synergy, right, where the music relates to ongoing organizing of workers, liberation theology, organizing of educational movements. In other words, that the struggle is being waged on so many different fronts. And the point I was making a few minutes ago is that all the other fronts in this country seem to drop away in the last 20 or 25 years, and the Grateful Dead were sort of left out there all alone, as it were, representing. That's obviously not true. There are other places where the same kind of energy is being displayed, but it doesn't have the same context that it has in other kinds of really revolutionary situations, so we can't expect as much of it.
Well, things drop away, opportunities drop away, but opportunities also are made by people. And if you have that many people who are at least intending to create something, or at least participate in the groundwork, or the possibility of creating something, that didn't happen.
I agree. I mean, I had this experience, I suspect the rest of us have, of being at a Grateful Dead show and seeing and feeling the tremendous energy and wishing that energy could be channeled in some sort of more socially constructive way.
Yeah, and I've always been mystified by what's going on with Fish fans, and they seem to be the Fish seems to be taking over the mantle of improvisational rock music, following in the tradition that the Grateful Dead were.
And their fans following them are...
Right.
Yeah.
And I think about things like what happened at the Red Rock show this past summer, where hundreds of Fish fans, frustrated that they couldn't get into the show, were busy messing around in Morrison, getting in the way. And in terms of, like you were saying, the fans not sort of taking those values into their daily lives, that's always been a mystery to me, because it seems like there's a certain lack of respect among a lot of Fish fans that I never felt among the Grateful Dead fans. At least until that mass popularity wave. That to me is something that has always surprised me. And the fact that Fish never made a public statement about what happened in Morrison. the way the Grateful Dead, for example, canceled their next show after that Indianapolis or Indiana fiasco where a bunch of fans rushed the stage and there were injuries and might have even been a death. They canceled the next show, whereas here these Phish fans this past summer sort of invaded Morrison, and there was no public statement by Phish that I saw, and I don't know if that's a factor of the media not choosing not to give their statement, but that notion of carrying the audience carrying the values into their daily lives, that's a mystery to me.
Well, it's difficult to change the society. The Western patriarchal society, I feel, has reached a critical mass, and it's really hard for anything to come up and supplant it. It's a society that's based on greed, on power, on lust, and you can make certain lifestyle changes and live a certain lifestyle. I certainly did. I lived out in the middle of nowhere for a number of years and tried to just get away from the society and try to do something different. But it's very difficult to, start something new and change the mainstream society. The society has a way of co-opting any type of alternative movement. Look at commercials on TV now, and any kind of alternative thing, they just jump on it.
Janis Joplin singing for Mercedes.
Yeah, and it becomes like a Calvin Klein commercial or something.
And
I don't
now
know.
Paul McCartney is Sir Paul. You can't get more establishment than
just
that.
yesterday.
Yes. Well, you think about I'm not sure it's fair to take the Grateful Dead as somehow emblematic of the changes that people were hoping for 25 years ago. But if we do that, it's really important to recognize how massive has been the assault by so many sectors of our society upon that, and still is. I mean, I think in so many different ways, whether you look at gender issues, whether you look at educational policy, whether you look at economic policy, and certainly politics, people are still fighting back against the 60s. People are still scared of the 60s. Fear of the 60s is still a major component. And so the assault on that set of values and on that vision continues, and it's really powerful. And so even to ask, certainly we can't ask of the 6 guys in the Grateful Dead to change the world, but even to ask of the 100,000 or 150,000 deadheads in the country to successfully somehow stand up against that kind of assault on their values, I don't know if it's at all a reasonable question to ask.
And I remember a real clear example of what you were talking about, Ira, in this terms of this resistance to those kinds of values. There was a letter written into one of the Chicago newspapers in response to one of the shows 4, 5, 6 years ago, and this person from across the street in the restaurant was leveling this savage critique on the irresponsibility of these fans and the drug use and the what have you. And meanwhile, he had never bothered to come across the street and participate. It was just this from a distance critique without any actual hands-on knowledge.
It's the same reason that the University of Colorado in the middle and late 80s, year after year, gave up a couple of $100,000 that they could have earned from booking the Grateful Dead into Folsom Stadium. It was just, every year they would find some excuse, usually a rather lame and trivial excuse, to keep the Grateful Dead out. And I always felt that it was a question of, obviously, of public relations, a question of the public image of the university, and that the Grateful Dead represented a certain image that the university didn't want to associate itself with because it was, as I said, the Reagan-Bush era, and it just didn't seem like the politically smart thing to do. I thought it was very sad. They lost a lot of money, and we lost some really good shows that way.
Could it be they were afraid of what the Grateful Dead were bringing? Afraid of that energy, that social transformation? It
might be. I think in terms of the university, my hunch is that, as I say, they were just afraid of the public image. That if something went wrong, see, if something went wrong at a sort of a conventional rock and roll concert, it was easy enough to write it off because it was conventional music, the kind of music that the Denver rock and roll stations play, and then you could write it off as a bunch of kids. It didn't represent anything in terms of real social cultural threat, right? But the Grateful Dead was a different story.
Well, that, okay, but that's what I mean, that it was a different story, and there is that cultural thread. But see, in the end, people were obviously going for the music. They were going to appreciate the art, and not just to appreciate the expression of the values in the music and in the experience. And I wonder if that took over, if that became too much of the experience because of the assault that you're referring to, Ira, that people insulated themselves in the experience of the art.
It seems to me a specious distinction, may I say, because the point we were making at some length earlier is how interwoven the music, the art, the style, and the values were.
Well, but the values maintain themselves inside the community, but then they're not going out. And it's that going out part that is of interest to me, and the reasons why it didn't go out. Well, obviously the fans held on in their relationships with each other, but then they didn't influence society.
And as I said before, I mean, we can bat this back and forth forever, but it seems to me that it was the very conscious and concerted efforts of so many forces within the society to prevent that from spreading. I mean, in a certain sense, of course, the Grateful Dead were tolerated, right? And they were tolerated as kind of like not only a traveling circus, but a traveling playground, where people could go and indulge their fantasies of the 60s culture in a harmless way. I think there's no doubt about that, right? They were tolerated because they were harmless. I mean, we know what the society does and what the authorities and the powers that be do when they really feel threatened. All you have to do is look at the Black Panthers or the Christic Institute or any of a number of institutions that were destroyed because there was a genuine sense of threat. So obviously, as Chris said before, what happened with the Grateful Dead is that they were co-opted, and Deadheads were permitted to indulge themselves because it was considered safe.
Keep it in a specific space. Keep that outburst in its place.
It was kind of like a traveling wilderness area,
right?
Right, right. That was you could go there and have your entertainment, and most people were going to be entertained. It's true, but I just don't know if it's fair to ask much more of the masses of people who went to those shows.
I don't want to ask it of the people, I suppose. I'm wanting to ask more of a philosophical question about art, and is art a hammer or is art a mirror? And your example of the Black Panthers, I think, is, apropos. How many Black Panthers would have been driving around with a bumper sticker on their car, or on their backpack, or a button that said "Peace Through Music"? And it's just, they were engaging the world on a very different level, a very basic level, that's different than culture, different than art and music.
Well, music and art have been used for a variety of movements, and not all music is peaceful. Not all art has portrayed peaceful regimes. I mean, there's Nazi art, and there have been kind of skinhead rock and roll music which advocated violence. I mean, so.
But as I said before, there is also the music of revolutionary movements, of working class movements around the world, which continues to be a powerful force.
Well, but I'm not sure that
when it's integrated into a broader cultural and political movement, and when it is politicized, sure.
Well, okay, yeah, integrated into a broader movement. I guess the simpler way to ask is, and I think the reason I wanted to ask this question of Deadheads is because of the power of the experience, the power of that audience experience, that participatory experience. But is it perhaps true that it's not possible to achieve peace through music?
It's hard to say. I mean, in the 60s it seemed like it was, and then things changed. I mean, you saw certain rock stars become rich and famous, and their music kind of changed. They became more middle class themselves, and they weren't advocating the revolution in the streets as they used to. And people saw that. People said, wait a minute, these are the guys who've been telling us, blah, 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 and now they're millionaires.
And the Coca-Cola sponsored Woodstock 95 or whatever it was. And I think what you were saying, Ira, about the notion of integration, I think art and music are only one social force. I don't think any single social force can change the entire social framework. So it's a matter of putting the revolutionary or transformative energy of the Grateful Dead as one tool among others that are involved in the process of transformation. So peace through music to me doesn't mean let's listen to music and we'll all love each other. It's that this has to be part of an integrated program in which we're doing peace through education, peace through any number of social institutions.
And certainly it might be a different conversation if we were talking about the Jefferson Airplane or Country Joe and the Fish. Right? But we're talking about a band that was very consciously chose not to be political and not to try to mobilize itself for political purposes, and did certainly focus on much more on individual transformation. Earlier on we were talking about that line, one way or another this darkness has got to give. I'm quite convinced, at least, that when Robert Hunter wrote that, he was very conscious of it as a kind of a westernized Buddhist song. He was very conscious of Buddhist allusions in that song, and he was talking about individual transformation. And it is true, and I regret it, that the Grateful Dead were not as political as they might have been. But even if they had been, I think that, as Steve was saying, music can be an immense force, and we certainly saw that during the Vietnam War era, right? If it is in a context of many other kinds of forces making those changes. Music by itself, on its own, is not likely to change the world. But wow, it can sure make us feel good, can it? And it can sure remind us of a sense of immense possibility that our culture has been trying to close off to us for the last quarter century. And that was, to me, is what made the Grateful Dead so important, is that they kept alive a kind of a slender thread of a certain kind of utopian hope that was very important to a lot of people once upon a time in our youth. And some of us have managed to hold on to it, and we're really, I think, quite pleased about that.
Well, I think on that poetic and hopeful note, I'd like to wrap things up. We'll go out of the show this evening with an old favorite of mine, Broke Down Palace. But I'd like to thank my guests for joining me. Ira Chernus, Professor of Religious Studies from CU.
Thank you, Richard.
And Steve Glickman, PhD student in English, also from CU.
Thanks a lot.
And Chris O'Reilly, KGNU regular.
Thanks, Richard. I went to CU as well.
Oh, okay. What'd you study?
I don't teach there. I just have a degree from there.
And so here we go with Broke Down Palace.
Fare you well, my heart. Fare you well, my only true. All the birds that were sown are flown, except you alone. I'm gonna leave this broke down house on my hands and my knees. I will roll, make myself a bed by the waterside. In my time, I will roll in a bed by the waterside. I will lay my head, listen to the river sing sweet songs to rock my soul. river gonna take me, sing me sweet and sleep. Sing me sweet and sweet, babe, all the way back home. It's a far gone lullaby sung many years ago. Mama, mama, many worlds I've come since I first left home. Going home, going home, by the waterside, I will rest my bones. Listen to the river sing sweet songs to rock my soul. Gonna play a weeping willow by the bank's green edge. It will grow, grow, grow. Sing a lullaby beside the water. Lovers come and go. The river rolls. Fare you well, fare you well. I love you more than words can tell. Listen to the river sing sweet songs to rock my soul.
And thanks for joining us this evening on Hemispheres. This has been a special New Year's Eve edition of Hemispheres on the Grateful Dead. Coming up next, we have Corriente on KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM community radio for the Front Range.